Hello, Old Testament class. Welcome to our last day of instruction, our last module of instruction. We'll be covering all the odds and ends of the Bible, particularly apocalyptic literature today. So Daniel 7 through 12 is a fascinating text, collection of texts. They seem to have been written each chapter 7 and then 8 and then 9. And then 10 through 12 really functions as one unit. All of them were written at different points in time. Some of them slightly different than others, but most of them right around the year 167 BC. Really interesting time. We'll get into the historical moment. It's where Hanukkah comes from, if you've ever wondered. But also, it really gets us pretty close to the time of Jesus and sets us up for studying some of the really important transformations that happen in ancient Judaism that prepare the way for the religious scene that exists at the time of Jesus. So if you've been wondering in our class why it is or how it happened that belief in a kind of a cosmic evil power, Satan, emerges after a period of time, when you read the New Testament, Jesus is casting demons out everywhere, but people in the Old Testament aren't casting demons out everywhere. So when did that change and had that come about? But also this notion that there's going to be an end to the world or a last judgment and resurrection. That's not something we really see in the Old Testament. There's mentions of God's judgment in the Old Testament, but those tend to be pretty definitive points in time after which other things will happen. It's assumed. But there's something really different about the religion of Judaism that existed at the time of Jesus. That is that there's this notion that there's going to be some sort of end to history. There's going to be a last judgment. Remember, the Pharisees believe in a resurrection. Jesus doesn't teach them something new about that. Jesus says there will be a resurrection, but there was already a belief in it. So where do these things come from? Well, all of that we're going to explore today in this module on apocalyptic literature in Daniel chapter 7 through 12. What you're going to hopefully see over the course of this is how ancient Israelite religion really transformed into the religion that Christians are familiar with from reading the Gospels. So this radical shift happens. It starts sometime around the year 175 BC. And all the way to the time of Jesus, there's this kind of dramatic change. Apocalyptic literature, especially Daniel chapter 7 through 12, is where we see this the most because it's the part of the Old Testament that is the latest. It's written closest in time to us. So if we think about like the prophets, remember we've got 8th century prophets, Amos and Hosea and Micah and Isaiah. Remember when we talk about the next kind of batch of prophets, that's the exilic prophets, right, where we have Jeremiah and Ezekiel. There's some other minor prophets in between, like Habakkuk, like Nahum, Zephaniah. But then we also move in time to the post-exilic prophets. So we talked about 3rd Isaiah. We talked about Haggai and Malachi and Zechariah. So these are prophets that, for the most part, reflect a Persian period setting, or just setting during the return after the exile. What we're going to be talking about today is set in the Hellenistic era. It's set in the time after the conquests of Alexander the Great. So, in any event, this is what we're going to be talking about, the rise of, we mentioned a little bit with Ecclesiastes, the rise of Hellenistic Judaism. We're really going to get into it today. Also, in honor of our last class, I've got my casual hoodie, my daughter Margaret Ann let me use her panda Beanie Boo to keep me company up here. So we're going to try to have a party for our last day. All right. So apocalyptic literature. This is so crucial to understand Christianity, to understand the history of apocalyptic literature, because Christianity is an apocalyptic group. Paul is an apocalyptic Jew. Jesus is an apocalyptic Jew. All early Christians would have been understood as apocalyptic members of Judaism, of the religion of Judaism. So another thing is like the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, or the people that John the Baptist hung out with. The Essenes might be the term for these folk. These are all apocalyptic Jews. Apocalyptic thought emerges within Judaism, and within about a century, it has influenced Greek thought. It's influenced really Egyptian thought. There's Egyptian apocalypses from near this time. It's influenced Persian thought. It influences Mesopotamian thought. Apocalypses start to emerge, but really historically we think these begin within Judaism. And they begin sometime in the 3rd century BC. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened there. We ran through that history really briefly with Ecclesiastes, but we're going to come back and go through it a bit more right now. Okay, so what is apocalyptic literature? Okay, first of all, when people say, hey, that's apocalyptic, they may not be talking about the same thing that we're talking about here in the Bible with biblical apocalypses. Apocalyptic literature is a genre, kind of like lament poetry, right? Or ancestor stories in Genesis, right? So apocalyptic literature is a type of literature. It follows a particular kind of set of rules almost for creating that literature. Just like with a fairy tale, once upon a time, it's got to be set in a land far away. It's got to have some little kids in danger, right? It's got to have a nice moral at the end of the story and a happy ending, right? Those are the rules for the genre of a fairy tale. Apocalyptic literature has its own rules. Today, people use the word apocalyptic to mean kind of like, I don't know, massive, major, an end, terrible, right? It can be used to mean all kinds of things. And we can even talk about apocalyptic mindsets or apocalyptic views. People who are like prepping for the end, for society to fall apart might be said to have apocalyptic ideas today. Those ideas, I think, in a way come from apocalyptic literature. But so we're going to talk about the very specific forms of biblical apocalyptic literature that we find only fully formed in Daniel chapters 7 through 12. And in Revelation. There's lots of other apocalyptic literature from ancient Judaism and from early Christians that we can point to, and I'll point to a couple of these works later on. But to say that the only two that made it in the Bible were some of these chapters in Daniel and Revelation. You'll talk about Revelation in your New Testament class, but this will form a foundation. It's the same genre. Revelation is building upon some of the insights from Daniel. So here we have, by the way, John of Patmos, a medieval tapestry of the angel coming to John. So there's some features of apocalyptic literature. Just like I said, for a fairy tale, like it's assumed that there's a parent talking to a child, that it's a story about children in danger, and there's a happy ending and a moral. So in the same way, here's the features, the major features of apocalyptic literature. Not apocryphal. That's the hidden books or whatever, the JV canon. But in any event, apocalyptic literature is pseudepigraphal, almost all of it. What that means is that there's an author named who's not necessarily the author. This is not just true for Daniel, where the works ascribed to Daniel in chapters 7 through 12 definitely reflect the time of basically what we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, the time of the Greek kingdoms dominating Jerusalem, and especially this moment of crisis that begins in the year 167 BC. So it's not written by Daniel, sorry, but this is a part of a larger genre. There's a book that's just about written at the same time as the book of Daniel, especially chapters 7 through 12, and that's the book of Enoch. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but Enoch is the guy from Genesis who's said to be taken up into heaven without dying. I mean, at least that's what it maybe says. It's actually a really strange bit of text, but we'll put that aside. All to say that later folks, Jews right about the time of Daniel chapter 7 through 12, when that was written, they were reading this book of Enoch and they were thinking, wow, that's some pretty cool stuff. That's really interesting. There's some interesting questions brought up by the fact that Enoch didn't die. So there was a book written that ended up being called First Enoch, that is scripture still in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but is I think not included as Christian scripture in any other living Christian group. And while it was very popular with Jewish authors, it fell out of favor with the rabbis, and so was not included in the Jewish canon. It's quoted in Jude, the book of Jude, that little tiny book. You don't ever say chapter to Jude because it's so short, right? But that actually has a reference to First Enoch in it, and Jesus may have a couple of references to First Enoch in his literature. All to say, this was a really popular book at the time of Jesus, and understood to be, at least in some ways, sacred. So in any event, it's not written by Enoch. Definitely not written by Enoch. It's written by people writing in Enoch's name. And this wasn't taken to be a lie, or this is before the ideas of like plagiarism. This is before the printing press. This is before the idea of academic credit for your work. So it wasn't considered evil to claim, or like trickery to try to claim someone else's name. It was writing through the experiences of someone else that you learned about through a text or something like that. So all to say, apocalyptic literature tends to be written in someone's name. It also always has a human recipient. That is, it's kind of a human gets this kind of a message of some kind, and that message is given by or interpreted by an angel, a messenger from God. Another important thing about apocalyptic literature is that it focuses a lot on angels. Have you noticed throughout the Old Testament that there's not a whole lot of detail when it comes to explanations or descriptions of angels? They're just people, or maybe there's even some ambiguity, like the 3 visitors in Genesis 18 that come to Abraham and Sarah. Like, they just show up out of nowhere, and then like one of them happens to be God, or all 3 God. I mean, there's Christian readings of this making them 3 parts of the Trinity, but then it's like they speak as I, and then the 2 of them just kind of vanish, and one of them is like talking to Abram and like haggling over what to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. All to say that story is really complex and complicated because angels are demoted in terms of how much interest is put into them by ancient Israelite authors, precisely because they wanted to not make you think about other divine beings. They wanted you to focus on one divine being, God, because they were trying to move in a way towards what we might call henotheism or monotheism, right? They didn't want you to worship other gods, other deities. And if you thought something was an angel in the ancient world outside of Israel, you would worship it. You would sacrifice to it because it's a divine being. It requires your honor and your attention. That's what sacrifice is. Ancient Israelite authors don't want you to sacrifice to angels, so they don't want you to think about them much. So they make them just kind of extensions of God's presence, and that's it. They don't name them. They call them angels or messengers, which demotes them in terms of their stature or status. Think of them as like minor divine beings, but also demons. They don't want you to think much about demons because they don't want you to worship them. They don't want you to sacrifice to them, which is what everyone did in the ancient world. So they just demote opinion about them, right, or interest in them. By the time Jews are talking in terms of apocalyptic literature, by about the year 200 BC, there is a lot of interest in divine beings, in angels and in demons at this point in time, in part because they've gotten a basic idea of monotheism, and now they can start to kind of focus on some of those other questions that we might have about, like, where does evil come from? Where might we find evil in the world? Is it just confined to human hearts? And that's a question that Jews begin to address sometime around the year 300, between 300 and 200 BC in a more careful way. We could also say this about angels. Angels start to get names for the first time ever, sometime between the year 300 and 200 BC. 2 of the first named angels are Michael and Gabriel, which we only find named in Daniel chapters 7 through 12. We find both of them there. That's the only part of the Old Testament you'll find a named angel. Sometimes you'll see an angel called the angel of the Lord, but that's it. I mean, that could be anybody, right? So, that could be any of the angels, assumed to be lots of them. There's a host of them, right? So by the New Testament, you can still get Michael and Gabriel, but you don't get much more interest in naming lots more of them. That comes somewhat later in Christian history to kind of name lots of the other angels. Eastern Orthodox theology does this quite a lot. But all to say that there's the idea that angels have to explain this information to you. So if you think about the book of Amos, right? Amos had things revealed to him, but he understood what they were. Like, Amos understood that an end was coming, and that end was that Jerusalem was going to get destroyed. I mean, remember, God says to Amos, here's a basket of summer fruit. And Amos is like, cool. Oh no, an end is coming, right? It was a play on that word, kayets and kates, for summer fruit and end. Amos gets what's going to happen. In Daniel chapter 7 through 12, Daniel doesn't get it at all. It's a mystery to him, even once it's revealed, like what's going to happen. These beasts come out of the ocean in Daniel 7. He's like, I don't get it. I need help. So an angel has to explain this stuff, every single chapter, to Daniel. The same thing happens in the book of Revelation. And this is unusual in terms of the prophecy we see in the Old Testament, right? So the idea that this is there's a human recipient receiving this information or seeing things that needs to be interpreted or mediated in some way by an angel. That's foundational to apocalyptic literature and found nowhere else in the Old Testament, really. And the content of this stuff is usually a revelation. Sometimes it's about space. In First Enoch, it's like a tour of the heavens, and part of it is about time. In the stuff that made it into the Bible, Daniel 7 through 12, and Revelation, it's really about less about space and it's more about time. So in biblical apocalyptic literature, it's about a revelation of the future. And it's usually understood to be kind of near future. It has to do with kind of in Daniel, it's about like a few years, which we'll see. But it's this revelation of something that's going to happen in the future. And this is foundational to that word apocalyptic. So apocalyptic comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means an unveiling or some sort of revealing. The idea there is that we are all walking around through our lives and looking at the world and thinking we see things how they really are, but we don't. We're looking through a veil, and we need to be kind of like unveiled or revealed, right? That's what apocalyptic means. Like if you took off some sort of like mask and saw the world, then that would be the unveiling, the apocalypsis. There's a couple people recently who have written, so Catherine Keller wrote an article in some newspaper recently. She's a theologian at Drew University up in New Jersey, and she wrote an article about how like what we're going through with COVID is in some way a revealing or an unveiling of like where our priorities really are. I mean, it's been obvious to a lot of people for a long time that a lot of our priorities in the United States are fairly cruel, but what's happening with COVID actually unveils or reveals some of this stuff. So in some way, it's kind of a revealing of how things really are. In Revelation, it's about the Roman Empire, and in Daniel 7 through 12, it's about what they're going through in a certain moment in Jewish history that I'll explain in a moment. So another element of apocalyptic literature is a periodization of time. Time is kind of divided into chunks that may not seem self-evident. And what it really is all about is kind of a telling of the story of history again. The next element there, ex eventu prophecy, that means prophecy after it's happened. What this means is that in apocalyptic literature, what you get is like usually this like story that goes way back in history, and like almost all of history is narrated in this one story that like goes in a way that you wouldn't expect. The reason is this. Jews living in the land of Israel during the period of the Persian period, but also later in time of the Greek kingdoms and the Roman Empire, they were living under the boot of an empire that was telling them how the world was, right? They were telling them what history was, where their place in history was, and of course for the Jews, their place was nowhere in history, right? The revelatory stuff in apocalyptic literature retells all of history so that you can see everything in a different way. Think about it like this. If your story has been told to you by other people who have been telling you your own story for the purposes of trying to subjugate you, then what you might really need is not just someone telling you that's fake, but you might need a new story, a different story, right? To convince yourself that that's not true, what you've been told about yourself your whole life. So the ancient Jews apocalyptic literature was written for them for the purposes of retelling their history so that they could be finally freed from some of the things that they had been convinced of by these dominant empires about God. Is God sovereign or not? How could your God possibly be important? Because the Babylonians dominated you. The Persians dominated you. The Greeks are dominating you. Where's your God? Your God is pathetic, right? If you want to see where God is active in history, maybe it's got to be somewhat narrated somewhat differently. Now, remember our last class, we talked about the Persian period and this notion that God seemed more remote or removed in the theology of the Persian period, a hidden or distant God. This is one way of re-understanding the story of God's dominance or sovereignty, control of the world. In spite of people telling you, hey, we dominated you, so that means your God stinks. Instead, you might say, actually, I do think God is at work here. Remember Daniel, in Daniel chapters 1 through 6, God let Jerusalem fall into Nebuchadnezzar's hands for the purpose of spreading the message of Yahweh abroad. Right? That's a very different way of thinking about God's sovereignty than like what the Greeks would be telling you about what that meant about your defeat, right? So apocalyptic literature develops this idea and deepens it and broadens it by retelling all of history. So this periodization of time, you can think about this like the four kingdoms, right? First there was the Babylonians, and then there was the Medes, and then there was the Persians, and then there was the Greeks, and then there was the kingdom of God. The kingdom of Yahweh. That's a retelling of history that upends the way that empires talk about themselves. Putting it into like, there was this empire, then there was this empire, then there was this empire. That shows you that empires only exist for a certain amount of time. And then somehow, kind of miraculously or strangely, they disappear, even though they seem so strong. it might suggest divine intervention, right? So all to say that this kind of retelling of history is for the purposes of organizing the people and reorganizing the way that they think about themselves. And this ex eventu means after the fact. What this means is that the prophecy usually kind of starts way back in history and goes up to a certain point, near the point at which the apocalypse was written. And then there's like this kind of brief intermission and switch to the present day. And then a brief step into the future. So for the book of Daniel, as we'll see, this has to do with basically like between the years 167 and 164 BC. It's like a 3-year period where there was a real question about what was going on. But in order to help them figure out what was going on there, they went way back into history and retold history up to that point. So next, the way that history is usually told through apocalypses is that since the beginning of time, there's been this massive struggle between good and evil. And what people might call this is a dualistic way of seeing the universe, or this is theological dualism. So dualism means there's two sides, good and bad. God's side and the devil's side. You'll notice that in the Old Testament up to this point, there hasn't really been this dualistic way of seeing the world, right? There's a refrain in the Old Testament that like the Lord heals, but the Lord wounds, but the Lord binds up. All right, the Lord strikes down and the Lord raises up. Yahweh does all these things. Think about the book of Job, right? Where do all the bad things come from? Satan, right? No, not actually. In the book of Job, the bad things come from God. Yahweh admits that Yahweh did all that bad stuff. The book of Job is not about the devil versus God. The book of Job is about how do we deal with being a monotheistic people and having one God be responsible for all the bad crap that happens in our life. And if we want to say that God is good, what happens? How do we deal with that? That's the question of the book of Job. Apocalyptic literature presents us with a change, a shift. Something happened that was so intense, so strange, so difficult to understand as an act of God that Jews ended up rethinking their theology of evil. The book of Leviticus says, instead of sacrificing to ward off demons, which is what everyone did in the ancient world, that's why you sacrifice, try to use the blood to get rid of demons or evil spirits. Instead, Leviticus says you're going to claim that lamb or whatever you're bringing to sacrifice as your own to get rid of your sins, right? Don't blame your sins on demons. Take responsibility for them and try to make up for them yourself, right? That's the theology of Leviticus. But what if that doesn't work one day? What if something happens that's so bad, so intense, so bizarre, so inexplicable that we can't say that God did it? I mean, like the fall of Jerusalem was horrific. And Jews still said at the time, like Jeremiah says, hey, God did this. Yahweh did this. And there's something that we did that played into this. And we can get out of it some way. I mean, that was their message. But something had to be even worse than the fall of Jerusalem to break that theology of Yahweh's responsibility over the entire earth and to make Jews have to go and rethink their theology of evil. And this is what we're going to talk about today. What was it that caused that break and caused a revisiting and a rewriting of the theology of evil to include something like a cosmic evil that's beyond the evil that's kind of summed up in all human hearts? Something else out there, but it's not Yahweh either. So, in any event, good versus evil and dualism. I should say, by the way, that this apocalyptic literature can be abused in some pretty serious ways, right, by Christians. Apocalyptic literature was generally written by people who had been subjugated in the ancient world. When it's taken over as a theology of conquerors, as a theology of people who think of themselves as being strong and who possess power and the power to subjugate others, this dualistic theology can be incredibly harmful, and it can come to terrible ends. So the American church, for one, needs to think really carefully about the way that we use apocalypse in apocalyptic literature, apocalyptic themes, dualism, to not make us the good guys, right? And using that term to refer to like the way that the U.S. tends to talk about its military adventures, right, around the globe. I think here of the time that a biblical scholar that I know, Thomas Romer, got a phone call from the president of France, Jacques Chirac, who himself had, at the time, gotten a phone call from the then president, George W. Bush, who said that he was going to explain the book of Ezekiel the Gog and Magog stuff from Ezekiel 38 and 39 to the president of France to try to convince him to go to war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the biblical scholar was like, I don't think that's referring to Saddam Hussein, right? But all to say that this stuff can lead to wars and domination, at least attempts at domination by powerful people. So we need to watch out for some of this theology. At the same time, this good versus evil dualism stuff is really has proven throughout history to be incredibly helpful to communities that are under attack, that are minority cultures under assault. The idea that, like, hey, the world is at least from one perspective simple. There is some evil in the world, and there's some good in the world, and good eventually will overcome evil. That seems to be the main message of apocalyptic literature. And for the purpose of telling people, and I'll skip to the very last one here, hold on to the end. That's a major part of apocalyptic literature. You got to hold on to the end. Stay fast in your faith. Don't give up now. God is going to help us. And even though it seems like God is being overwhelmed, we're being overwhelmed, God will be with us. Hold on to the end. Stay faithful. That's the main message of Apocalypse. It's really a encouraging message to those suffering persecution. That's the idea, at least. That the second to last thing there, numbers, codes, and myths. The way it's expressed is generally through these bizarre seeming kind of stories with really bright, almost like shocking stories of sometimes violence, of bizarre things like dragons and sea monsters and composite beasts that roam the land and get in fights. And you read Daniel chapter 7 and you think, what is this stuff, right? There's also lots of mentions of numbers like 1250 mornings and evenings, or a time, times, and half a time, right? These kind of strange numbers and secret codes that you have to read, like 666 in Revelation, right? All of these things are part of this apocalyptic genre. In part, some people have said maybe this is to kind of escape detection from a major empire. I think more so it's to try to help us see that there's different reasons for different parts of this. The codes and secret codes sometimes is to tell us that it's really hard sometimes to see the truth of the world. That the truth of the world sometimes is hidden. It's a mystery, and it needs to be unveiled for us or revealed for us. I think that's part of why those images exist. They also captivate us, right? And some people have also pointed out that some of the things like snakes and dragons and women clothed with the sun, that stuff in part, it speaks to us in a symbolic language that has to do with the symbols that existed at the time in the ancient world. A bit like a political cartoon. If you see a donkey and an elephant talking to each other, you know what's happening. It's about the Republicans and the Democrats. But 200 years from now, someone might say, what the heck is this stuff, right? What are these donkeys and elephants talking to each other? So it might be kind of political cartoons of the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire talked about itself as a lion a lot. So did the Babylonians. So you see lions show up here, and maybe it's saying something about the power, the images of power, or the tree in Daniel 4 that grows up and covers over the whole earth. The tree of life was a major symbol for Mesopotamia. So all to say, so a lot of these probably connect to imagery that was used by kings and by empires in the ancient world. A lot of the imagery in Revelation has to do with the Roman Empire. So apocalyptic imagery really is anti-imperial. It's trying to convince people that love God, that love Yahweh, that God will be with you, and that all of these things that try to convince you, the propaganda that you're getting from the empire that's trying to convince you that it's useless to fight back, you need to submit to the empire, there's no hope for you, there's no hope for your God, there's enough clues in the world for you to see beyond what looks to be plain truth and see that there's a deeper hidden truth that underlies all of that. There's a deeper force, a deeper power operating in history, and that's God. So in any event, this is the basic genre, the basic outline of apocalyptic literature. We could say, where does this stuff come from? It comes from the Jews. It becomes hugely powerful and popular throughout the ancient world, even just a couple centuries after it was created, but it comes from Jews. And it probably draws out of some of the prophetic imagery that you can see throughout the Old Testament. So things like Ezekiel 40 through 48, where Ezekiel is taken in the spirit and is shown a vision of what's about to happen in a rebuilt, a kind of reconstituted Jerusalem. Some of the imagery that we see in Zechariah chapters 9 through 14, which is what we might call proto-apocalypse, or Isaiah chapters 24 through 27, where there's like this strange vision of the end of the world, it seems, kind of, where there's some sort of massive battle and heroes are risen up out of their graves and they share a feast and death itself is defeated. This is, testifying to Yahweh's power to overcome even death itself, which is this kind of moving towards apocalyptic literature. The book of Joel is associated with kind of this movement from prophecy towards apocalyptic literature. Where Joel is talking about visions and of the end. There's the locust kind of vision, but then there's also visions of people having kind of an overflow of the Spirit and the power, being filled with the power of the Spirit, but also this kind of terrible judgment at the end. So we can see that there's a movement here. It's also influenced by probably the Judaism's encounter with Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. The ancient religion of Persia was a dualistic religion. There was a good god, Ahura Mazda, and a bad god, and they fought against each other. Except that they were like equally matched. In Judaism, of course, Yahweh is more powerful, but there's still this kind of notion Jews would have encountered during the time of Persian domination, the idea that maybe there is an evil power that's not Yahweh in the world. There's also other historical influences that we can see throughout time and space that build up to this, but those are the two main influences, it seems. One other thing to talk about is that prophetic literature and apocalyptic literature both talk about the end. Eschatology is the big theological word that means the end, study of the end. When we talk about like like Christology means the study of Jesus, basically like, is Jesus fully God or fully human or both? That's Christology. How does that work? Eschatology is the study of the end. We can say that there's a couple different kinds of eschatology here. Oops, I gotta move my face, my big old face here. Okay. Not now, iCloud. Okay, so there's a couple different kinds of eschatology that we can see in the Old Testament. One is prophetic eschatology. What do the prophets have to say about the end? So prophets like Amos said there was an end coming, but they didn't mean the end, right? They meant an end to our country, our this kingdom, right? This nation. But it will go on. We will go on. Faith in God will go on. That's not an end to the world. It's just the end of something now. So, the prophecy that Solomon's kingdom is going to get broken up, well, that's the end of that kingdom, or at least part of it. But it's not the end of all time. Apocalyptic eschatology, which only emerges sometime in the Greek period, the Hellenistic period, that is the end, like the real end. And it's not the total end of everything. It's not like the universe ends and there's nothing. It's that there is an end after which there's a radical break in time and space. There's going to be a judgment usually is associated with this. There's a resurrection that is usually the idea is that people come back. As we'll see in Daniel, maybe the same kind of resurrection that Jesus talks about, but there's a resurrection. This kind of a rise in the idea that God will reward some and punish others. That is the idea is that the things that the justice that wasn't taken care of on this earth will be taken care of then. Again, that idea can be abused in Jewish and Christian theology, but for those who have suffered through great abuse and injustice and who die without seeing any movement of justice, perhaps this idea that God somehow is going to take account of that in the end, that may have been very powerful, and I think it is really powerful. So in any event, that's the difference between prophetic eschatology, like an end to the nation, and apocalyptic eschatology, the end. Okay, like I said, Jewish apocalypses it was a popular genre starting in sometime around the year 250 or so BC, and continuing until the time of Jesus and beyond. So here's some popular Jewish apocalypses from near the time, from starting sometime around the year 250 all the way to people make these today, kind of biblical sounding apocalypses, but they were a popular genre all the way up through the Middle Ages. But so the first Enoch is a book that again is a scripture for the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian community, and it is the first parts of it started to be written sometime around the year 250 BC. Second Baruch is another Jewish apocalyptic text. Fourth Ezra, sometimes also called Second Esdras. This is a beautiful text. It's in here in your HarperCollins Study Bible, and it was written by Jews after the year 70 AD, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and which was, as you might imagine, the second temple being destroyed. I mean, this was a traumatic event, and so it's dealing with the trauma of the loss of the temple, and it's a dialogue. There's an angelic mediator who's trying to explain why this might have happened. It's in part a theodicy. Theodicy means asking the question of, like, why did this bad thing happen if there's a good God? Fourth Ezra might be one that, over the summer, just, bookmark that one and come back to it. It's got some beautiful theology in it. There's also some other apocalypses that end up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Apocalypse of Moses and the Apocalypse of Metatron, which sounds a little bit like like an action figure or something, something that comes from a Marvel movie, but it's not. It's an ancient angel, and it's sometimes called Third Enoch. And you can just Google Third Enoch or Apocalypse of Metatron. You can read that online. The Qumran War Scroll, that was from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scroll community was an apocalyptic community which saw the division between good and evil, and the end was going to come. It's very likely that John the Baptist comes from a community that was associated with the Dead Sea Scroll community, or at least some larger group that both of those entities were associated with. John the Baptist is talking about light and dark and good and evil and baptizing people, which they did in a way at the Dead Sea Scroll community to try to get out the evil spirits and stuff. I mean, this is we're kind of moving along the way to what the New Testament assumes is kind of normative for Judaism at the time. Which, again, if you read the Old Testament, you just won't see a lot of these things. Another question is, like, where do the Pharisees come from? You don't read about them in the Old Testament, or the Sadducees, and, all that stuff. All that emerges seemingly out of nowhere, because if you're just reading the Bible, because we're missing some of that intervening literature. But Daniel 7 through 12 is one of the few things that kind of bridges that gap a bit. So, I've mentioned this a few times, but I'm going to talk about it now for a little bit. That is the transition that happens after what we call the Persian period. So remember, we've got like the Babylonian period and then the Persian period. And then now we're going to talk about the Hellenistic period, the period of the Greek kings. These Greek kings came in the wake of Alexander the Great, who dominated the world, as we said before, created a vast empire, and then died promptly before doing much about it to make it an empire. It just was kind of this loosely associated group of places that Alexander conquered or that surrendered to Alexander and gave him lots of money. When he died, his kind of generals that succeeded him broke up his kingdom into lots of different parts. It ended up that just a few really ended up kind of dominating the others and creating these massive kingdoms, two of which fought over Judah for quite some time in Jerusalem. So that's what we're going to talk about today. That created the background for the crisis moment that led to the reforming of Jewish theology that we see happening in the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12. So, starting in 333, this is around the time when Alexander the Great steamrolls through the Levant, and then 63 BC is when Rome takes over as the dominant power in Judah. So why is Pontius Pilate, there for the time of Jesus? Is because Rome has taken over as the next kingdom. So that we'll save that for New Testament class. But here we go. I'm going to move my face out of the way. 3 critical moments that we can say in Hellenistic Judaism. Okay, so I mentioned during the Ecclesiastes lecture that once the Greek kingdoms take over, they tend to try to spread the use of Greek, and they try to spread the influence of Greek culture, especially among the elite and among the scribal class. So we call this Hellenistic Judaism, Judaism that's inflected by Greek ideas. And this went everywhere. I mean, there was no Jew that wasn't influenced by Greek ideas to some degree or another. During the time of Jesus, they were all Hellenistic Jews. It wasn't like there were old-style Jews versus new-style Jews, although there was a break in terms of how do we become Hellenistic Jews, right? How do we adopt these Greek? Where do we draw lines, right? That became a crucial question. But during this period of history, 333 to 63 BC, we have 3 big moments that I'm going to talk to you about today. And the first is Alexander the Great. I already mentioned him, so we'll go quickly through him. But the second is the setting for the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12. That's 167 to 164 BC. This is the mad King Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epimanes, the madman, as he was known afterwards, and the Maccabean revolt. This is the first ever known in history attempt to eradicate a religion. So people had attempted to eradicate other peoples before as peoples, but the idea of getting rid of a religion, getting rid of the worship of one God, a certain God, no one had ever thought to do that before. Until 167, and of course, it wasn't the last time that people have tried to, or at least had a plan to eradicate Judaism from the planet. Of course, they've failed. But nonetheless, this is that moment of crisis, because if Jerusalem was under assault and was destroyed because they didn't conduct their alliances properly, that's one thing. If there is a king that's trying to destroy your faith in your God, no one had thought about that in the history of the world up to that point that we know of. So this was the moment that seemed that kind of broke Jewish theology and forced them to rethink their notions of evil. And then the third moment in history that I won't get to this or mention it really, but just to say this kind of the end of Greek rule and the beginning of Roman rule in Palestine. Sort of. This is all there's ways to talk about it all. But there's an independent Jewish kingdom that begins in 164, sort of independent. Really, it's subservient to some of the Greek kingdoms. But there's a fairly important moment of regional rule here, and that's the Hasmoneans, the Jewish kings that ruled Jerusalem and its environs from 164 to about 63 BC. Of course, there were two different kings that from this family that wanted to be king of Jerusalem, and both of them appealed to Rome for help, and Rome said, "We would love to help you by taking you over and taking all of your money." And they put Herod in charge because they could control him. So that's how Herod the Great comes to be king in Judah. Okay. So, as I said before in the Ecclesiastes class, Alexander the Great begins his major conquests in 334. By 332, he's defeated the Persian Empire, and he's taken all the Levant, he's taken Egypt, he's conquered most of Mesopotamia. He goes into the Indus River Valley, into India, and moves up into Bactria, which is, modern China, Tibet. And he's taken over and conquered an incredible amount of territory. He suddenly gets sick and dies in Mesopotamia, gets sick, I think, in the Indus River Valley, and then ends up dying in Mesopotamia. In 323, may have been poisoned by one of his generals or someone jealous of him. But what he leaves behind is chaos. And here's just a little map of all of the places that he conquered within the span of about 10 years. Imagine the huge transformations that this would have constructed throughout the world. Now, the thing that this does is it creates a network of places that now have a lot of contact with Greek culture, have Greek soldiers settled in them, begin to think about and use Greek political systems. So this is a major change in terms of the world, but also in terms of like communication and roads, and so this is a major moment in the history of the Near East and the Mediterranean basin. As I said, this leads in all cultures that come into contact with Alexander's army leads to this hybridization, this kind of combination of Greek culture and then these other local cultures. The word Hellenization is actually invented by the Jews who, when they're writing a book called Second Maccabees, use this verb Hellenitzein, like to Hellenize, Hellenish. Hellene means Greek. So Hellenization means like Greekification. So it's not fully Greek. It's not fully, it's a kind of Greek stuff and your local cultures mixed together, which people in Egypt did, people in, Mesopotamia did, and people in Israel did. So here's, by the way, this is Esther. This is in Greek letters, but a Jewish woman's name and the menorah on it, all to say that these cultures all get kind of melded together. So, in the wake of Alexander's death, several generals can grab more territory than others. Seleucus, a great general, grabs the territory that you see highlighted in pink here from Antioch all the way to Babylon, and then into Bactria, which is basically Tibet and near the Indus River Valley. And then the other kingdom, the other major kingdom that exists is the Ptolemaic kingdom, which if you know Cleopatra, she's a descendant of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals from Macedonia, who ends up, when Alexander dies, he runs to Egypt because he knows it's powerful and wealthy, and he sets up shop in Egypt and controls it, and then builds Alexandria, named after Alexander, which becomes its capital, the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom. So you can look and see the boundary between these two empires is Israel, and they fight over Israel for 100 years. There's 100 years of chaos basically in the region. Jerusalem is destroyed at least a couple times. There's very little documentary evidence of this time. That is like not many things survived from all of these battles and wars in writing, which might tell you some of the chaos that was happening. But also, this is the century that apocalyptic literature begins. Probably no coincidence, right? A century in which there's like untold chaos and destruction that continues to ravage the land for 100 years, and then a brief period of peace, and then there's the time of the persecution, the great persecution of Judaism. All of that happening in the span of a century basically broke Jewish theology, and apocalyptic literature was born as a result. As I said about the Ptolemaic Empire, this is who first comes to rule Jerusalem between 300 and 200 BC. Things go okay at first, and they get progressively worse in terms of taxation and domination. And then the Seleucids end up kind of wrangling control from the Ptolemies. These are the folks who, you can see that empire highlighted there. These are the folks who really have their power base in Syria and in Mesopotamia. They end up taking control of Jerusalem. And at first it's awesome because they declare a tax holiday. They want to make friends with the Jews. They want to restore power to the Jews and give them local control. It's totally awesome. They love it. Within a generation, everything has gone to pot, and the Jews are in revolt. How did that happen? This, by the way, is Seleucus I, just a bronze sculpture of that general. So this guy, Antiochus IV, called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, or the appearance of God, who was called by many of his subjects Antiochus Epimanes, which means the madman. This guy was the fault. So in 175, he becomes the emperor of the Seleucid kingdom, and they own Jerusalem and work with the local high priest there, who is the kind of highest political authority there. To try to rule. And Antiochus IV runs into a couple problems. He tries to invade Egypt and he loses badly. He runs out of money. He needs lots of money quick. He starts to steal it from temples. So Antiochus IV has this brilliant idea that he is going to steal all this money from temples, local temples throughout his empire, to pay for his war debts. This doesn't go over so well anywhere, especially Jerusalem. But one thing is that the Jews revolt, or at least they resist his authority a number of times. One other thing happens is that he sells the high priesthood to the highest bidder. And at least it seems that the priest, Onias III, who was the high priest, claimed descendants, that he was a descendant of Zadok. All the way back in David's day. Remember that guy Zadok? Like when in the book of Samuel, right? I mean, this was like one of the great grandchildren of Zadok. It goes all the way back, 1,000-year-long history of this family being high priest in Jerusalem. And, Antiochus seized the office and sold it to the highest bidder, to a guy named Jason, who's actually related to Onias III, but just was able to pay more money and take over being high priest. Now, Jason is not a Jewish name. I don't know if you know this, but it's a Greek name. So this is a guy who really is in favor of Greek things, and he refounds Jerusalem as a colony of the Greek Empire. He builds a gymnasium, which is a place where a Greek youth would be educated in the ways of how to be Greek. This is a big deal and affront to many of the Jews at the time, that they think this is evil, right? Greeks exercised naked in the gymnasium. This was seen to be kind of gross to Jews, but also many Jews became uncomfortable with their own circumcision, and so tried to, according to the book of Maccabees, reverse their circumcision, which I don't know how that happens. But all to say, it caused this big fight over what it meant to be Jewish and marks of Judaism and their eating practices and their educational practices. And you can imagine what a big change this is. Even Maccabees even says that there's this, they start wearing crazy hats. that make the old people mad. Anyway, there's lots of things people will get mad at, right? About cultural change. But some of those things are important. Like, where do you draw the line between being Jewish and not being, like what makes us Jewish? And we talked about this with Daniel and Esther. So this comes back up again. So Jason is only high priest for 4 years until a guy from a different family named Menelaus takes the money that Jason was supposed to pay to keep being the high priest, and Menelaus steals it, gets more money, and says, now I want to be high priest. And of course, the king Antiochus IV says, I don't care who's fine, I'll take the money, you're priest now. Well, Menelaus becomes the high priest, but this makes people pretty mad because he's now the high priesthood has been sold outside of that family, the family of Zadok, for the first time in 1,000 years. This makes people so mad, but then also Antiochus is trying to steal money from the temple. There's what appears to be a revolt. Jason actually tries to reconquer Jerusalem with an army. He fails, but this makes Antiochus IV so mad that he figures that the Jews must be rebelling time and again because they're programmed to do it by their God. Their God is evil. Jason, the God of the Jews is what Antiochus IV says is evil, and the worship of this God needs to be eradicated. So he starts to say that people are, if people have Torah scrolls, they're going to get burned. The Torah scrolls will be burned, and the people will be killed. If women have their babies circumcised, which they should on the 8th day, then the babies and mothers will be pushed off of the wall of the city of Jerusalem and killed. So this is a terrible time of persecution, and the religion became persecuted. Being a Jew was persecuted, which just broke people's minds. They could not figure out how to understand what was happening. So in this context, you might imagine, right, that when you have this horrible, awful, destructive thing happening, that it might make you revisit your notion of where God is in all this. And that's where apocalyptic literature comes from, this moment of terror. So 167 is when the terror really begins, when Antiochus begins to try to eradicate Judaism as a religion. He sets up a different altar inside the temple, dedicates the temple to Baal Shemayan, the Baal of the Syrian soldiers who were stationed nearby, who worked for this guy, and they slaughtered pigs, as was their custom in the temple in Jerusalem. That is, these Syrian people sacrifice pigs to Baal Shemayan. Of course, this is not kosher, so this was taken to be this massive desecration of the temple of Yahweh. Not only was it given to foreigners, but pigs were sacrificed there. This was understood to be the abomination of desolation. And there were images of the emperor set up in different places, Antiochus IV. This was taken to be an abomination as well, right? Yahweh doesn't like images, but also this is like having other gods before me. This guy, Antiochus, called himself a god. So all of this just seemed like, and the priests couldn't sacrifice and so on. There's a kind of a war that erupted. Judah Maccabee, it's actually his dad who started this thing, but there's a priestly family from this little town named Moda'in nearby, and they refused to sacrifice, and basically renounce Yahweh, and they refused to sacrifice to the Greek gods and to the Greek emperor. So when they refused, they began a revolt. And this family, the family Maccabee, which means the hammer, so it's probably like a nickname really for this guy Judah, they begin a revolt. And Judah is this guy's son of a priest, Mattathias, who started this revolt. And Mattathias dies pretty early on. Judah takes over as the leader. And he actually dies in the middle of the conflict too. But several of his other brothers take over. And this family is called the Hasmonean family. And they found that dynasty that becomes the actual first Jewish dynasty that has ruled as kings since the time of David's family. So this starts in 167. By 164, they have reconquered the temple and they rededicate it. That's Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the rededication of the temple in 164 after the desecration that took place in 167, when the emperor Antiochus IV sent the Syrian soldiers in, rededicated the altar to Baal and began their sacrifices there of pigs. So this is the 3 years, right? So in the book of Daniel, we see time and again this reference to times, and half a time, or to somewhere around 1,300, 1,400 days, or around there. This ends up being basically the amount of time that between 167 and 164. That is, that the things that happen in Daniel refer to this point in time and to this historical event, and we'll see that more clearly in a little bit. So we're going to pause here. I want to ask you about what you think about apocalyptic literature and about this point in time, about our own point in time. Do you think apocalyptic literature, from what you've encountered, is good, is bad? Should we stay away from it? Should we embrace it? What about it is captivating to you, or what about it makes you wary of it? All of us have seen Left Behind. Some of us might have different reactions to it than others, but try to move away from the kind of pop embracing of it. But what about actual apocalyptic theology that you can see in the biblical text? What about that is worrisome or helpful to you? And in response to your own experiences. We are in maybe an apocalyptic time right now. We'll have to see. But we'll come back and we'll talk about the book of Daniel. So I look forward to engaging you in the forums.